Hi everyone. This week we're covering the chapter on gendered power and violence. This chapter is probably the most important chapter in the textbook, and then also I think just the most difficult. I mean, it's the most sensitive topic, it's the most important topic, and one thing I want you to try to do is look back. Your textbook author, and I suppose myself in the creation of the modules, have been kind of leading you to this of one of the end goals the whole semester to try to make things clear. But before you get too deep into this week's content, I want to draw a really clear line for you about what we're really talking about here. There's a difference between hypermasculinity and masculinity. They are related, but they are not the same thing. So we've talked about before, gender is a spectrum. Masculinity and femininity, androgyny, all that stuff's mixed up in there. And now we're going to add one more component, and you could add more components than just this one, but we're going to talk about hypermasculinity, which is a hyper version, an exaggerated version of actual masculinity. So it's not just assertive and direct, which is more masculine behavior, it is aggressive. That's hypermasculinity. It's not just competitive, which is a masculine behavior. It is hyper competitive. Like there's a huge consequence if you don't win. That's hypermasculinity. And I can give you countless examples, but I really want you to understand that they're not quite the same thing. And that you need to understand that because otherwise you're going to get the wrong message of the chapter. One of the main core messages from this chapter is that hypermasculinity leads to violence and it enables violence. I just said aggression, right? And some scholars might even contextualize that a little different way than what I just did, in that they might take it a step further and they might say hypermasculinity is itself violent. I'm not quite brave enough to go all the way that far, but some people would definitely say that. So I bet Jackson Katz is one of them, to be honest. So you're gonna read more from Julia Wood, who's saying hypermasculinity causes problems, it leads to aggression and therefore violence. And Katz is going to take a even little harder line, and he's going to say hypermasculinity that is violent to him. So, but they're really saying something quite similar there, almost the exact same thing. And so both of these scholars and other scholars like them have ample evidence and research to support that the notion that hyper masculine communication styles or ways of behaving cause problems, and lots of them. And so that's what I want you to think about, and I need you to separate it from masculinity because they are not the same thing. And they are not saying, these scholars are not saying that masculinity itself is a problem. They're saying hypermasculinity is the problem. And that's, if you don't understand that, it's going to be really hard to get through this chapter because, like if I use emotion as another example, okay, well, a masculine communication behavior is I'm going to hold in my emotions more. And granted, that could also be a personality trait. Like if you're more introverted, that's going to happen too. And that is not, sometimes it's good for you, sometimes it's bad for you. The problem becomes when it's done all the time. And because you repress your emotions, and then that tends to just lead to bigger emotions. Now we're starting to get into, as long as it's not a personality trait, it's more of a communication style and it's linked to gender, then now we're starting to get into hypermasculinity where it's gone so far that it's causing damage. That's why I'm trying to get you to draw the difference, because if it's been balanced out, if it's still healthy, then it's fine. You could be healthy and be masculine. That's certainly possible. The problem is when it goes too far. And that's where we enter in this term of hypermasculinity. You might have heard of it in a couple other terms, but that's the one that I'm going to use because I think it's the most applicable and the least loaded. So try to separate that out for yourself this week. Masculinity isn't by itself, by definition, the problem, but hypermasculinity can cause some problems, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So as you work through the modules this week, I want you to keep that in mind, okay? It's a tough subject, but it's a really, really important one.